The news broke with the force of a tectonic shock. On the night of June 21, 2025, the world learned that the United States military had executed a series of devastating strikes against Iran's most sensitive nuclear facilities. President Donald Trump, in a late-night address from the Oval Office, declared the operation a resounding success. He spoke of spectacular and very successful attacks on the Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan sites. He claimed these heavily fortified locations were now completely and totally obliterated. This was not a warning shot. This was a direct, unilateral act of war, justified by the administration as a necessary measure to neutralize an imminent threat to global security. The operation itself was a stunning display of American military might. B-2 stealth bombers, flying a marathon 37-hour mission directly from their base in Missouri, unleashed their payloads over Iran. They dropped the formidable GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb used for the very first time in combat. U.S. Navy submarines, lurking silently in the region's waters, launched a volley of Tomahawk cruise missiles. The message was unambiguous. The United States had the will and the capability to reach any target, anywhere. The strikes plunged an already tense Middle East into a new, terrifying chapter. This dramatic military action immediately ignited a firestorm of debate back home. The core question was not about the capability of the U.S. military, but about the authority to use it. Did the president have the right to launch such a significant attack without the explicit consent of Congress? Lawmakers, journalists, and constitutional scholars immediately began to dissect the decision. The strikes were celebrated by some as a decisive blow against a dangerous regime. They were condemned by others as a reckless overreach of executive power, an act that bypassed the democratic process and risked a catastrophic, wider war. The controversy laid bare a fundamental tension at the heart of the American system of government. It's a tension that has existed for generations. Who truly has the power to take the nation to war? Is it the legislative branch, the body elected to represent the will of the people? Or is it the executive branch, led by a commander-in-chief tasked with protecting the nation from harm? The bombing of Iran's nuclear sites on that June night was not just a military operation. It became the latest and perhaps most dramatic case study in this ongoing constitutional struggle, a moment that forced the country to confront the immense power vested in a single individual. The effort to stop the march to war had begun, but it was a race against a clock that was ticking far too fast. In the weeks leading up to the strikes, as tensions between Israel and Iran escalated, a small but determined group of lawmakers in Washington saw the writing on the wall. They feared the United States was being drawn into a direct conflict. They knew that if Congress was to assert its constitutional authority over matters of war and peace, it had to act preemptively. This understanding spurred the introduction of war powers resolutions, legislative tools designed specifically to prohibit the president from launching an unauthorized attack on Iran. On June 15, 2025, Senator Tim Kaine, a Democrat from Virginia with a long history of advocating for congressional war authority, introduced such a resolution in the Senate. Just 2 days later, on June 17th, a bipartisan duo in the House of Representatives followed suit. Republican Thomas Massie of Kentucky and Democrat Ro Khanna of California, representing opposite ends of the political spectrum but united on this constitutional principle, introduced their own companion bill. Their goal was clear: to force a public debate and a vote, to make Congress go on the record before any bombs were dropped or missiles were fired. The problem they faced was not a lack of will, but a lack of time. The legislative process, by its very design, is deliberative. It's meant to be slow and methodical. Even privileged resolutions, which are granted a faster track, are not instantaneous. The House resolution, for example, contained a provision that required a waiting period of 15 calendar days before it could be brought to the floor for a full vote. This waiting period is intended to allow for committee review and debate, but in this case, the machinery of government was simply no match for the speed of military planning. The White House, meanwhile, was operating on a completely different timeline. While lawmakers were introducing bills and counting the days required by procedural rules, the Pentagon was finalizing flight plans and targeting coordinates. President Trump reportedly made the final decision to strike on June 19th. The order was executed just 2 days later. The resolutions introduced by Kaine, Massie, and Khanna were still languishing in the early stages of the legislative process when the B-2 bombers were already in the air. Their efforts, born of a genuine concern for constitutional order, had been rendered moot before they even had a chance to be debated. The President of the United States holds a unique and powerful position as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. This authority, granted by Article 2 of the Constitution, allows for a level of speed and decisiveness that the legislative branch simply cannot replicate. When the White House perceives an imminent threat, it can mobilize the vast resources of the U.S. military in a matter of hours, not weeks or months. This capacity for swift action is often seen as a strategic necessity in a world of fast-moving dangers. In the case of the strikes on Iran, the administration leveraged this power to its absolute fullest extent. The decision to attack was made within a small, closed circle of senior advisors. The operational details were kept under a tight lid of secrecy. This stands in stark contrast to the open and often messy process of congressional deliberation. A debate in the House and Senate would have involved public hearings, classified briefings for all 535 members, and extensive media coverage. It would have laid bare the arguments for and against military action, exposing internal divisions and potentially revealing strategic plans to the adversary. The executive branch, by its nature, can bypass all of this. It can act with a unity of purpose and a speed that Congress, a body of competing interests and ideologies, can only envy. This executive advantage, however, is the very thing that makes it so controversial. Critics argue that this speed comes at the cost of democratic accountability. The decision to commit the nation to an act of war, they contend, is too monumental to be left in the hands of one person and a handful of unelected advisors. By acting so quickly, the president presents Congress and the American people with a fait accompli, a reality that has already been created. The debate is no longer about whether to go to war, it's about how to manage a war that has already begun. This effectively sidelines the legislative branch from its most solemn constitutional duty. The strikes on Fordow and Natanz became a textbook example of this dynamic. Before most members of Congress even knew that a final decision had been made, the mission was underway. The war powers resolutions designed to force a debate were instantly transformed from proactive measures into reactive protests. The executive branch had not just won the argument, it had preempted it entirely. The speed of command had triumphed over the slow pace of deliberation, demonstrating in dramatic fashion how presidential authority can outmaneuver the legislative process in matters of national security. The conflict over the Iran strikes is rooted in the very text of the U.S. Constitution, which deliberately creates a tension between the powers of the president and Congress. Article 1 grants Congress the sole power to declare war. This clause was of paramount importance to the nation's founders, who were wary of concentrating the power to start conflicts in the hands of a single executive, as was common in the European monarchies they had rebelled against. They believed that the momentous decision to send citizens into battle should belong to the branch of government most accountable to the people. This is the foundation of the argument made by those who called the strikes on Iran unconstitutional. Simultaneously, Article 2 of the Constitution designates the President as the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. This role gives the President the authority to direct the military and to respond to immediate threats to the nation's security. Proponents of strong executive power argue that this authority is broad and essential. They contend that the President must be able to act swiftly and decisively to defend the country without being shackled by a slow and potentially indecisive legislative body. The Trump administration's justification for the Iran strikes rested squarely on this interpretation of Article 2, framing the action as a defensive measure against an imminent nuclear threat. This inherent ambiguity has fueled a power struggle that has lasted for more than 2 centuries. Presidents of both parties have consistently pushed the boundaries of their Article 2 authority, while Congress has often struggled to effectively assert its Article 1 powers. The nature of modern warfare, characterized by rapid technological change, non-state actors, and the need for split-second decisions, has only tilted the balance further in favor of the executive. A formal declaration of war has not been issued by Congress since World War II, yet the United States has been involved in numerous military conflicts since, from Korea and Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan. The strikes on Iran represent a particularly stark example of this ongoing struggle. This was not a response to a direct attack on U.S. forces. It was a preemptive strike against the sovereign territory of another nation. Critics like Democratic Senator Tim Kaine and Republican Representative Thomas Massie argued forcefully that this action was not a defensive response, but a clear act of war that required prior congressional authorization. The administration's counter-argument, that it was preventing a future threat, stretched the definition of self-defense to a point that many found constitutionally untenable, reigniting the timeless debate over where the president's power ends and Congress's begins. Beyond the constitutional arguments and the constraints of time, the failure of Congress to prevent the strikes on Iran was also a story of raw political power. In June 2025, the Republican Party held majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. This political reality fundamentally shaped the dynamics of the situation. A Congress controlled by the president's own party is inherently less likely to act as a check on his authority, especially in the high-stakes arena of foreign policy. The instinct is often to rally around the flag and support the commander-in-chief, rather than to challenge his decisions. The leadership of the Republican Party was brought into the fold before the strikes were launched. House Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader John Thune were among the small group of congressional leaders who received a briefing from the White House ahead of the operation. This is standard procedure, but it also serves a political purpose. By informing the leadership, the administration ensures their support and helps to unify the party message. Sure enough, after the strikes were announced, the bulk of the Republican caucus publicly praised President Trump's decisive action. Senator Ted Cruz, for example, lauded the move, reflecting the view of many in the party that it was a necessary and long overdue measure. This partisan alignment meant that even if the war powers resolutions had reached the floor for a vote, their chances of passage were slim to none. Overcoming a presidential veto requires a two-thirds majority in both chambers, a nearly impossible threshold in today's polarized political climate. Most Republicans were not inclined to vote for a measure that would be seen as rebuking their own party's president and undermining his authority on the world stage. The legislative effort was therefore doomed not only by the ticking clock, but also by simple arithmetic. There was no viable path to a veto-proof majority. While the majority of the party stood with the president, it is important to note that the support was not unanimous. A small but vocal faction of Republicans, often described as non-interventionist or libertarian-leaning, broke ranks. Representatives like Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene, along with Senator Rand Paul, strongly opposed the strikes. Their objections were not based on partisan loyalty, but on their interpretation of the Constitution. They argued that an unauthorized strike was an overreach of executive power, regardless of which party occupied the White House. This created an unusual alliance with progressive Democrats, but their numbers were far too small to change the ultimate outcome. The attempt to stop the strikes was not a purely partisan affair. It was honestly a fragile, cross-party coalition of lawmakers who believed that Congress was abdicating its constitutional responsibilities. The effort was spearheaded by figures like Democrat Ro Khanna and Republican Thomas Massie in the House. They were joined by senators like Democrat Tim Kaine and Republican Rand Paul. These members, despite their deep disagreements on nearly every other issue, found common ground in their conviction that the power to initiate war must reside with the legislative branch. Their push to pass a war powers resolution was a direct challenge to the executive-centric status quo. Their strategy was to use the legislative tools at their disposal to force a public debate. By introducing a privileged resolution, they sought to bypass the normal committee process and bring the issue directly to the floor of the House and Senate. The goal was to make every single member of Congress take a public stand. Would they vote to authorize military action, or would they vote to prohibit it? They hoped that the prospect of being on the record for supporting a new war in the Middle East, without a full and open debate, would persuade enough of their colleagues to support the resolution and reassert congressional authority. However, these efforts were met with overwhelming institutional and political headwinds. The first major obstacle, as discussed, was time. The executive branch's ability to act with speed and secrecy rendered the legislative process almost irrelevant. The resolutions were still in their procedural infancy when the strikes were already a concluded military operation. The debate they had hoped to force was about a hypothetical future. The president, with his actions, made that debate instantly historical. It is difficult to prohibit something that has already happened. The conversation immediately shifted from prevention to consequence. The second obstacle was the powerful force of party loyalty within the Republican-controlled Congress. The majority of GOP members were unwilling to publicly break with a president from their own party on a major national security issue. Democratic leadership, including Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, strongly condemned the president's unilateral action and called for an immediate vote on the War Powers Act. But their condemnations, without the support of a significant number of Republicans, were politically toothless. The bipartisan coalition, while principled, was simply too small to overcome the combined forces of executive speed and partisan solidarity. Their stand was valiant but ultimately futile. At the center of this entire controversy lies a single piece of legislation, the War Powers Resolution of 1973. Enacted in the shadow of the Vietnam War, this law was Congress's attempt to reclaim its constitutional authority over the use of military force. The act requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action. It also prohibits armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days, with a further 30-day withdrawal period, without a congressional authorization for use of military force or a declaration of war. It was intended to be a powerful check on presidential power. However, the War Powers Act has been a source of legal and political debate ever since its passage. Presidents of both parties have consistently viewed it as an unconstitutional infringement on their authority as commander-in-chief. They have often complied with its reporting requirements, but have rarely, if ever, conceded that the law actually limits their power to act. The act's effectiveness has been further complicated by the changing nature of conflict. It was designed for prolonged troop deployments, not for the kind of swift, limited, high-tech strikes that have become more common in the 21st century. The strikes on Iran expose this ambiguity perfectly. The Trump administration argued that a one-off series of airstrikes does not constitute the kind of hostilities that would trigger the 60-day clock of the War Powers Act. This is a common argument used by administrations to justify limited military actions. They contend that such strikes do not put U.S. forces in sustained danger, and therefore do not require congressional authorization. From this perspective, the president was acting within a gray area of the law, fulfilling his duty to report to Congress but not requiring its permission to act in the first place. This interpretation effectively sidelines Congress. If the president can order significant military operations, like the bombing of another country's nuclear program, and claim they fall outside the scope of the War Powers Act, then the act itself becomes largely symbolic. Critics argue that this interpretation makes a mockery of the law's original intent. They contend that launching dozens of missiles and bombs onto another nation's soil is undeniably an act of war, regardless of how long it takes. The debate over the Iran strikes thus became a debate over the meaning and relevance of the War Powers Act itself. Was it a meaningful constraint on the executive, or a paper tiger that could be easily ignored? The June 2025 strikes on Iran did not happen in a vacuum. They were the culmination of a long trend of expanding presidential war-making authority, a pattern that has been unfolding for decades under presidents from both political parties. Each instance of unilateral military action creates a precedent, making it easier for the next president to do the same. This process of drift, as some have called it, has slowly but surely unmoored American military power from the constitutional anchor of congressional approval. The action against Iran was a bold move, but it followed a well-trodden path. Consider the 2011 military intervention in Libya. President Barack Obama authorized U.S. participation in a NATO-led air campaign to protect civilians from Muammar Gaddafi's regime. The administration argued that it did not need congressional authorization because the U.S. was playing a limited, supporting role, and that the action did not rise to the level of hostilities under the War Powers Act. Critics, including members of his own party, argued that this was a clear act of war that required legislative approval. The intervention went ahead, setting a powerful precedent for future presidents to use military force without a congressional vote. More recently, in January 2020, President Donald Trump ordered the drone strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. This was a highly targeted and incredibly swift action, taken without any prior notification to the full Congress. The administration justified it as a defensive measure to prevent imminent attacks on American personnel. The move was praised by supporters as a decisive blow against a terrorist leader, but it was condemned by opponents as a reckless act of assassination that brought the U.S. to the brink of war with Iran, all without the consent of the people's representatives. These historical examples and many others created the political and legal environment in which the 2025 strikes became possible. Each previous instance of a president acting unilaterally chipped away at the expectation that Congress must be involved. It normalized the idea that the commander-in-chief has the primary authority to use force. When President Trump ordered the strikes on Fordo and Natanz, he was not inventing a new presidential power. He was exercising a power that his predecessors had steadily built and reinforced over time, pushing the boundaries just a little bit further than they had before. In the final analysis, the inability of Congress to prevent the U.S. bombing of Iran's nuclear sites was an almost inevitable outcome, the product of a perfect storm of constitutional ambiguity, procedural limitations, and political reality. It was a demonstration of a system where the balance of power in matters of war has tilted decisively, perhaps irrevocably, toward the executive branch. While a bipartisan group of lawmakers fought to assert their constitutional role, they were ultimately overwhelmed by forces far more powerful than their resolutions. The first and most decisive factor was the element of speed. The presidency is designed for swift, decisive action, while Congress is designed for slow, methodical deliberation. In a crisis, speed almost always wins. The White House was able to plan, approve, and execute a complex military operation in a fraction of the time it would take for Congress to even schedule a proper debate. The legislative process, with its rules and calendars, was simply too slow to keep pace. The resolutions aimed at preventing the war were still on the launch pad when the missiles had already hit their targets. The second factor was the political landscape. A Congress controlled by the president's own party is a weak check on executive power. The Republican majorities in the House and Senate created a political firewall for the president. The party leadership was aligned with the White House, and the majority of the caucus was unwilling to publicly challenge their commander-in-chief. This partisan unity ensured that even if a vote had taken place, any resolution to block the president's action was destined to fail. The small, principled, bipartisan coalition that opposed the strikes never had the numbers to succeed. Finally, the entire episode was undergirded by decades of precedent. The slow erosion of congressional war authority over many administrations had created a reality where presidents are expected to act unilaterally. The strikes on Iran were not a shocking aberration. They were the logical extension of a long-developing trend. In the end, Congress stood powerless not because it failed to act, but because the system itself has evolved to favor executive supremacy in matters of war and peace. The smoking ruins of Iran's nuclear sites served as a stark monument to this profound and ongoing shift in the American balance of power.